So this is going to be class number 5. Yeah. Got some good stuff going on. So let's do quick review. So almost like quiz questions. So what is the hermeneutic that we are utilizing? What is it called? Dun dun. So our hermeneutic.
Contextual, historical.
Yes. Is historical, contextual, or you can put it vice versa. Okay. One or the other, flip-flop it, whatever way you remember it, historical, contextual. Very good. So we mentioned that we're taking the approach that the Bible is the written account of God's covenant journey with mankind, right? So what was the first covenant that we reviewed? The Noahic. Yeah, the Noah. So the Noahic covenant, I'll just say Noah. All right. And what was the promise?
Never again would he destroy the world by flood.
Right. No flood. All right. And what was the sign of the promise? Rainbow. Nice. Okay. And then what was the covenant that we did last week? Abrahamic. Yeah. So Abraham. And you know my next question. What was the promises?
His seed would be multiplied.
Yes, so that means that he would be a great nation. Great nation. Yes, and the blessing of the world that comes from his name would be great. To bless. Right. Right. So then you had some secondary ones, right? Those who bless him will be blessed. Those who curse him will be cursed. And what was the sign of this covenant? Circumcision. Yes. Circumcision. You can kind of also, think of when we were talking earlier about what makes a covenant, and we were talking about a covenant is between at least two parties, and it was binding, and there were roles and responsibilities on each side, and then we said it was signed. So you can kind of think that these signs are, in a way, the proof that the covenant is in effect. Because when you want to confirm that there is a legitimate contract, what is it that you look for on the contract? Is it signed? Is this contract signed? Is it binding because it's been signed? So these are your signs that the contracts, the covenants in a way, are kind of binding. All right. Very good job, class. A+. You all are great students. Okay. So here's what's going on. So the next covenant that we're going to get into is the Mosaic covenant. Now, when you usually think of the Old Covenant, if somebody mentions to you, oh, well, we don't do that anymore because that's Old Covenant, or because of Jesus, something in the Old Covenant has either been done or has been fulfilled or something of that nature. Not all the times, but more often than not, when people are saying Old Covenant, they're thinking Mosaic Covenant, with a few exceptions, and we'll get to them as we get to Jesus and the new covenant. But that's what people are usually thinking. When they think old covenant, they're thinking Mosaic covenant. And that is why I said, as we were introducing the class, that not everything in the Old Testament is old covenant, because the Mosaic covenant doesn't come into effect until we get halfway through the book of Exodus, right? So we have a lot of stuff in the before then that has taken place, and a lot of time, as we were talking about, right? The whole book of Genesis in and of itself was almost 2,500 years of time. So we've got a lot of time that's taken place before the old covenant has even come into effect. So just put that in your mind. Now, we also talked about canons, right? And we said that the Bible itself is actually a collection of covenants and a canon that surrounds the covenant. So all of the history, the art, the music, the culture, everything that goes on surrounding the covenant is sequential. Well, not sequential, but you can think of the Bible as a collective whole, has these 5 covenants combined. When we start talking about the Mosaic covenant, technically we could start at Exodus 1 and go all the way through Exodus 18, but we're not. We're not going to do that. Not because it's not important, but for this class specifically, we want to start talking about what happened with Moses and the Israelites and God in this thing that is called the Mosaic covenant, because it's quite complex. So everything about Moses' birth and his life and his young childhood and his life with Pharaoh, and then him leaving, and then the plagues, and the escape out of Egypt, that's all part of the canon. All right? But we're not going to dive into that as part of this study. What we're going to kind of talk about is what Dr. Welton likes to call Israel's worst moment. Okay. All right. So, what we need to understand is prior to Mount Sinai, we've got almost 2,900 years that take place. And in that 2,900 years, we talked about there was no law. Correct? There was no law that was in effect. There was a standard of conscience, if you want to put that back in your notes. So what ends up happening here, this is kind of like, this is going to be a preface. When you open up a book and you have a kind of a preface or an outline, it kind of tells you what's going to happen. So you can kind of put these as your little footnotes. But the covenant with Moses at the beginning was a kinship covenant, okay? So then you've got the law for 1,300 years until Jesus. And we want to recognize, if you want to pull out 2 Corinthians in your Bible, when you read 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, what is this note? I've got notes all over my Bible. I don't even know what they're from. Notes in the notes. 2 Corinthians 3, 6 says, He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. All right? So, as we jumped forward to that, Paul says the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So what is the letter? The law. The law brings death. The Spirit brings life. So if there is a theme that you kind of put as your foundation as we begin this study on the Mosaic covenant. This is something that you should wrap your heads around. This is going to help you a lot as we start unpacking all of this. So prior to the law, which brought death, we learned, especially with the Abrahamic covenant, and even with Noah, and even with Sodom and Gomorrah, we learned that it wasn't law. What's that? You're saying the promise? No, that's not what I'm referencing. I'm referencing that prior to the law, we had a standard of conscience. And if people were operating under a standard of conscience and were operating under a faith or a belief and a trust in God, that God was faithful to use mercy and kindness as he interacted with mankind. All right? After the law came, though, we see a complete difference in what happens. There's a new pattern of death and punishment that begins as soon as the law was put in. So when you're reading your scriptures all the way through until Mount Sinai, God operated under a different standard. Once the Mosaic law came into effect, especially specifically for the Hebrews, a new standard. So what we have is we have before the law and we have after the law. All right? So I'm going to give you a little breakdown of some examples of some things. And if you want to pull them up on your own, you can. It's a lot of scripture, so we're not going to go into all of them. But in Exodus 15, 22 to 26, you have a lot of grumbling. Grumbling before the journey. They're not happy with what's going on. Why are we here? Why are we even doing this? All right? And what was the result? Well, there was no punishment. God just lovingly plodded them along. Almost like they were, young, innocent little kids, right? You have Exodus 16, 1 through 5. You have grumbling regarding manna and quail. Right? So they wanted food. God gave them manna and quail. And after a little bit of time, they didn't want manna and quail no more. They were tired of the manna and quail. No punishment. Okay? I'm just going to say X for Exodus 16, 27 to 30. You had Sabbath violations. Now, you might say to yourself, well, I thought the Sabbath violation, how can you have a Sabbath violation if the Ten Commandments haven't been released yet? And you don't have the thou shalt, honor the Sabbath. Well, it's because the story of creation was familiar. All right, and even though Moses was the one who wrote the first 5 books, he wrote it because those stories were passed on from generation to generation to generation to generation. So in that culture, having a mindset that God created the world and that there was supposed to be a day of rest that was given was contextually accurate. So when there was a Sabbath violation, the result was just a little reprimand. You can read it if you like. It's about similar to a slap on the wrist, telling them, behave. Behave. And then in Exodus 17, 1 to 7, you have grumbling, again, over water. All right? What was the result? Well, there wasn't any. No punishment. It's So jot those scriptures down on your own. Go read them on your own. If you want to do a study of Exodus, you can kind of get an idea of how God interacted. So let's fast forward for a second. We're going to do that little time jump, and we're going to go into Numbers. Now, Numbers is going to be after the law has already been given, right? And we have some examples of things. Okay. So in Numbers 11, 1 to 3, you have grumbling just about their circumstances, about where they are. They're in the wilderness. You got some grumbling. What was the result? Destruction by fire. Same thing, grumbling. We don't like this. We don't want to be involved in this. We don't want to be here. This is not what we want. Here, no law, no covenant. Result, no punishment. Here, covenant is in place, which we haven't talked about yet, but there's a covenant in place. They have certain responsibilities. God has certain responsibilities. If they don't honor their responsibilities, God has to be faithful to his position and execute judgment. Destruction by fire. Numbers 11, 33 to 34. You have the grumbling about manna and quail. What was the result? Plague that killed. See a pattern starting here? Numbers 11, 33 to 34. You have Numbers 15, 32 to 36. You have a Sabbath violation. What is the result? Death by stoning. Everybody's like, I don't like this law thing at all. It is tough. It's hard to wrap your head around it when you really think about it. Numbers 21. Oop, that looks like a 3. Sorry about that. Numbers 21. And you have 4 to 6. What do you think it is? It's grumbling over food and water. Food and water. And what was the result? Deadly serpents. Okay. So what you see here is a demonstration, just picking some examples where you have similar actions done by the Israelites, but the way God responds is different. Now, is God the same yesterday, today, and forever? So and that is true. Absolutely, he is. But if that is true, we have to reconcile this. Why did he respond differently? Now, if you want, you can try to dive into the scriptures and try to find out if there's anything else that's going on. But the pinnacle here is this. And Paul addressed it. If you want that scripture that I was pulling up, it was 2 Corinthians 3:6. 2 Corinthians 3:6. That's where he talks about, now we are ministers. We are competent ministers. We have to understand this. We are competent ministers of a new covenant. Not of the law, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Because the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. It's a huge deal. It's a huge deal. So when we start talking about understanding covenant and what covenant are we in, we don't want to be in this covenant. But it exists. Did. Exists. Did. I'll tell you that later. We good? All right, can I erase this? All right, so we have to ask ourselves, all right, so what happened, right? So that was kind of a preface to you as far as what is the deal with this thing called the Mosaic covenant. And it's the first time we've ever really gone in depth comparing one covenant to another. We did a little bit of comparison with the Abrahamic, saying it was probably closest to Jesus' covenant, as far as something that was just a grant covenant, and his name is going to be great, he's going to be a great nation, fill the whole earth, that type of thing. So it's about as close as you can. But this we wanted to go in depth just for a second so that you kind of know what's going on. So what is it that happened? Why would God give Noah a grant covenant? Because walking in faith. Why would he give Abraham a grant covenant? If you remember, a grant covenant is a covenant where a greater party and a lesser party come into an agreement where the lesser party has to do absolutely nothing. The greater party just simply does all of the work and gives as a gift or as a promise to a lesser party, and all they have to do is receive by faith that is going to be there. But why not with Moses? Why was there not a grant covenant? Well, interestingly enough, let's look at some timeline here, because it kind of was supposed to be. Yes?
In the beginning, on Sinai, didn't he offer a grant covenant?
Yes, and that's what I'm going to go to. So the first, when I said the first Mosaic covenant started as a kinship covenant, it's because it did. It did start as a kinship covenant because it was ratified as a kinship covenant. But that wasn't what God wanted. He wanted a grant covenant, but that grant covenant never came into existence. So it never started as a grant covenant, although that was his heart. All right? So if we were to put on here, why not grant covenant? Big question mark, right? Why not a grant covenant? Well, in Exodus 19, 3-6, it was intended to be a grant covenant like the rest. So let's go there. We're going to spend a lot of time beginning at Exodus 19. So Exodus 19. It's page 84. Exodus 19, 3-6 says, Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you out to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possessions. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites. So Moses was basically commanded to give to the Israelites God's message. What was the message? God wanted a nation of priests. He wanted the Israelites to be his voice so that they could represent as priests the rest of mankind, or represent God to the rest of mankind. They were designed to be those that would help reconcile man back unto God. All right?
Is that a kinship?
That would have been a grant because they didn't have to do anything.
Okay.
They had to do absolutely nothing. It was just, this is my desire. All you have to do is say yes, believe in faith. Just like Abraham, just like Noah. All you have to do is believe that this is what I want you to do. So when you get to 19:8, what basically happens is the people, they accept At first, they say, that sounds great. Let's do it. Okay? And then in 19:9 through 13, what ends up happening is God continues to give to Moses a whole lot of instructions regarding consecration. Because in order for this covenant to be ratified, the people had to go and meet with God and speak with him. All right? But before they could go and speak with him, God was about to give them some commands of consecration. So there are commands to consecrate. And it has to do with cleanliness and, I don't know if I spelled that wrong. Consecrate? Eating, food, things of that nature. So you have some of those things going on, right? Because in 3 days, God was going to come down on the mountain, and he was going to meet with all the people. So then, in 19, verses 18 to 19, what happens? God shows up. Clouds, thunder, fire, all kinds of stuff. So God shows up on the scene, right? Now, boy, I keep pulling. I'm going to just keep this thing off because I'm going to break this thing in a minute. All right. Now, before we read what happens here, we have to understand that there's two accounts of the story. So you have this account in Exodus, but then you have a revisit to the story when we jump ahead into Deuteronomy. All right? So if we were to jump ahead, and I'm going to read Deuteronomy chapter 5, and I'm going to read from 23 to 27. All right? This is after the Ten Commandments. These are the commandments. Oh, let me start on verse 23. Sorry that. So basically what's happening here is again, this is a summary. So they're revisiting back in time what happened. So it's the story about how the Ten Commandments were given. And then it says, when you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leading men of your tribes and all your elders came to me, and you said, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. Today, we have seen that a man can live even if God speaks with him. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal man has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire as we have and survived? Go near and listen to all that the Lord God says. Then, and I'm going to insert you, Moses, tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you. We will listen and obey. So what happened right there? So we're going to do a segue. This is Deuteronomy 5, 23 to 27. What ends up happening is Israel steps back. Now, you don't read that in the Exodus account, but you do read that in the Deuteronomy account. And it helps put things back into perspective, because as we continue to read in Exodus, we start to find out that the people are not there meeting with God. The only one that's there meeting with God is Moses. So why is that happening? And it's because of this right here. So what was supposed to be a grant covenant, rejected, is what happened right there. And this moment is what Jonathan Welton likes to call Israel's worst moment. Because at that point is where everything changes. So if here we go into 19 in verses 20 to 25, we have Moses meets with God. Okay. Now, it is also a little bit confusing without a knowledge of historical context because not all of Israel went up to meet with God, but it does mention priests went up with Moses. So now we have a paradox. Okay. Israel has rejected. There is no law. So therefore, there is no instructions for priesthood. There is no Levitical priesthood that has been established. So we have to ask the question, who are these priests that went with Moses? The answer can only come from understanding history. And this is where our hermeneutic comes into the picture. So there's a book that he quotes in there that I read it and I showed it before. It was that ancient Near East and Middle Eastern thought from the perspective of the Bible. That's where it started talking about all the different type of gods and all the different types of ways that God interacted with the Israelites as compared to how other gods interacted with their folks. But he goes into a lot of detail to talk about what life was like in the ancient Near East for a typical family. Now, a typical family was not the way Amy and I live with our children. We have a house and we have 3 daughters, and they kind of do chores when they're supposed to. 2 of them have kind of grown up and are out. But it was nothing like a homestead or a family unit that you would see in the ancient Near East if you were to go back 4,000, 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. So you would have family units that would collectively work the land, they would work together in everything that they were doing for the sake of the family and sake of the homestead. Well, in that scenario, the priest of the household was always the oldest male. So we cannot be confused and say that this doesn't make sense because priests went up with Moses. It was not priests in the sense of the Levitical priesthood as outlined in the law, which had not yet been released. It was contextually eldest males went up. So the nation didn't go up and meet, but the eldest males of households did go up. And yes?
Deuteronomy 5:23 mentions that.
Yeah, does it? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All of the heads of your tribes and your elders.
Yeah, see? Exactly right.
So that's definitely.
So instead of responding in faith, like Abraham did, okay, they were filled with fear. So, no faith, filled with fear. So there was no grant. Now we can look at some of these type of situations and we can say to ourselves, well, that's a little offensive for God to test the Israelites in such a way to scare them to death with thunder. I mean, if God wanted to have a grant covenant, why didn't he just come down on a soft pillowy ball of cotton and land on display so that everybody could come and see how nice of a God we have and begin this big thing? But God does have a way of operating in what could be construed as an offense because of what he asks us to do sometimes. We just learned about Abraham, right? Now, What did he ask Abraham to do? He asked Abraham to sacrifice his only son at a ripe old age that Abraham was, no less. So the prospects of having another son were probably pretty slim in his eyes. And yes, we did discuss how culturally that was still a normal type of request, but still, we have to say to ourselves, that was a pretty bold move for God to say, I'm going to test Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his son. But there's other things too. You look at Jesus. When Jesus walked the earth, when he was about his healing ministry, right? There's a lame man laying down. Can't walk. Does Jesus go down and help him up, prop him up on his knee, and say, okay, Zeke, try to take one step. I'm going to heal you. No, he doesn't say that. He looks at the lame man and says, get up and walk and take your mat with you. And that's it. Right? Could be construed as an offense, right? Now, I don't have the faith to look at somebody who's in a wheelchair who is more than just clearly unable to walk, but if they've got physical deformities that make it look like they can't walk because they're physically not able to walk, if I were to say to that person, oh, I have Jesus in me and you can have Jesus in you, just get out of that wheelchair and walk, that could be construed as offensive to that person. Yet that's the way that Jesus operated. That's the way that God operated. So I'm not telling you to go out there and be offensive, okay? That's not what I'm telling you to do. But when we look at some of these things that God did, we do have to reconcile that things that we could construe as offensive, God is actually looking for those with faith. And he found faith in Abraham, he found faith in Noah, but unfortunately he didn't find faith in the Israelites. Yes?
And Scripture says that as he was in a situation where there was little faith, he could do very little in the miracle, except for heal a few. Presumably that's because of their faith.
Yeah.
But God would know they didn't have faith.
Were you here for the Abrahamic covenant? So did he know that Abraham was going to pass the test or not? No. This is where we start getting into, this is, you have to ask yourself if you want to expand your probability of understanding God in the realm of open theism. And open theism is going to state that God doesn't necessarily know everything, not because he's not capable of knowing everything, but because he chooses deliberately to limit himself because he's more interested in a partnership walk with us. Yes, exactly. So, well, I'm about to erase the whole thing, so you better take your picture. Okay, so there are some things that we would have to say to ourselves, it's possible that God didn't know. And as one person emailed me the other day, started asking the question, yes, because then why do we pray? Why do we even ask him to do something if he already knows anyways? And that's a tough question too. And that could be a whole thing if we want to have the next 6 weeks discussing that concept. So, all right. So let's think for a minute about what a kinship covenant is. We're going to do some more historical context here. Okay. So what happens in a kinship covenant? A kinship covenant was recognized in the ancient Near East, ANE, if I abbreviate that way, as something that was established in the form of a ceremony. Okay? So what you would have is a kinship ceremony. And in this ceremony, inside this ceremony, you would have things take place. Now, so when God gives the 10 Commandments to the Israelites, I'm just telling you right now, what took place there was a ceremony. There was a ceremony that was executed to ratify this kinship covenant. So we know what happens, right? God cuts himself, he cuts tablets out of stone, and he writes the commandments, the 10 Commandments, on these tablets, gives them to Moses. So, we have this picture in our mind, probably thanks to, what's his name? Charlton Heston, right? We think these tablets are these, beautiful, rounded top commandments, and then each commandment has a Roman numeral next to it, right? So, exactly. So Rome didn't even exist yet, but we have Roman numerals for our 10 Commandments. It looked legit, right? Okay, we laugh at that now and we say, well, clearly that's not the case, right? Okay, so, however, let's look at Exodus 32, 15. It says, Moses turned and went down to the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. What does the next sentence say?
The tablets were God's work. Wait a second, hold on.
That's right.
Tablets which were written on both sides.
Both
They
sides.
were written on one side and the other.
Okay, so we've been taught, first of all, yes, there are 2 tablets. Now, taking all that time to have something nice and well and rounded, whatnot, no, that probably wasn't the case. You probably had 2 square tablets of stone, roughly, of stone. But you did not have 2 tablets where one side was completely blank with 5 on one side and 5 on the other. Okay, that's what we've been taught. That is not what took place. First of all, we know based on that verse that at the very least, we know that they were written on both sides. So if we were to stop right there, we could say, well then, Chris, it's possible that it was because the depending on the law, some of us say just don't steal. But then the other one says, you shall honor the Lord your God and have no other gods before me. That took up a lot of room. So maybe this one was like 1, 2, and then on the back, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? You could do it that way. You could think, okay, so they were put up that way. All right. So I'm going to outline for you what historically a kinship covenant looked like when it was executed, because it happened all the time. All right? So this is what would happen. You would have party 1, and you would have party 2. So you have 2 parties that are getting ready to have a kinship covenant. So what do they have? They have the rules, the regulations of this covenant, and they would write them down on tablets. So in this case, we'll use 1 tablet each. So on this one, you would have their tablet, and this one, you would have their tablet. 2 tablets, each tablet had the same thing written on it. Front to back, you would have the same thing. Why would each person have their own tablet? Because it was the rules and the regulations. Usually, when you had kingdoms entering into these relationships, these would be delegates. Maybe they're the kings themselves, but they'd be representatives of the nation. So what would happen? Well, you would have these two different nations would take their tablet, right? And they would take their tablet and they would put it into a box. And this box would be placed in the temple of their faith, of their religion, and their big mighty God, all right, this is a big God person, would be the one who would enforce that the kingdom would be faithful to honor the regulations in the covenant. And if they were not faithful, this person or this kingdom would have judgment enforced by their own God, because they made this covenant not believing in the other person's God, because they didn't believe in that other person's God. They believed in their God. So they would make sure that their God enforced the covenant. So this whole idea of having an ark of the covenant is not something that's exclusively unique to Israel. They would put the ark, or they would put the covenant into a box or an ark. And it would be stored there, and throughout the course of time, you would oftentimes have other aspects of the culture put into that covenant ark because it represented life under that covenant. Okay? Does this make sense so far? Does not make sense to you? Okay, so where are we losing it so far?
Well, I'm losing it, well, I get the parties and I get the nations and all. But if they don't believe in each other's God, how would they believe that the other God would execute the punishment or whatever?
It doesn't matter to them. Because all they're interested in is making sure that they get their obligations. All right? So if they don't do something that they're supposed to, their God is going to discipline them. If they don't do something that they're supposed to, their God is going to punish them. That's just simply the way that the arrangement.
Okay, so their God isn't going to punish them.
No,
It's their own God.
that's correct.
Okay, that's where I was losing it. Okay.
Yep. Very good.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah.
the other party will see their punishment,
Yes.
know that they disobeyed.
Yes.
So that's how you'll know that they didn't keep their covenant, because they'll see that they were punished.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
That's true. At least in their own minds, because, yeah. Exactly. Now, we have a conundrum, though. Oh, I just... You got to be fast. So we have a little conundrum. And the conundrum we have with Israel is, okay, so you have two covenants, or two tablets, right? And you have Israel, okay? And who is the God that is over Israel? Well, it's God, right? Now, the other party over here is God. So how is God? Huh? Yeah, Israel doesn't look like they're winning there, right? This is not working out very well.
Doesn't Scripture say he swears by himself?
Yes, exactly right. It puts God in a strange position because God now has to have something over himself. And what does he put over himself? His word. So if you look at Psalm 128, verse 2, it says, "You have magnified your word above your name." So whatever God says that he is going to do, he will be faithful to it. So the only way that God could have anything above him was that he was going to be over himself by his word. But he's also over Israel as their punisher. So when this covenant is established, and I want you to compare that to how God interacts with us now. In this relationship, God is, I'm going to go like this. God is their partner, but God is also their punisher. He's their partner, but he is also their punisher. As a party in this covenant, God has to hold himself accountable, right? As a covenant partner, he has to punish Israel for disobedience. Is that right? No. She's going to say I'm a horrible writer. So if you don't fulfill the obligations of the covenant that's in the ark, God is going to act as their punisher. Okay? Now, in this instant, he is their punisher, but he is also their covering. So God is also their protector. He is their protector based on the way that the covenant was established. He was going to be their covenant partner and protect them as they began their existence in this promised land that he's telling them they're going to go to. So let's think about that for a second. I'm pretty grateful that I am not in a covenant with God where he is my partner and my punisher. You know, it's just it's a difficult place to be in. And yeah, right? How do you love him? But here's the thing. We need to think for a second. So later, when we start talking about the new covenant, we're going to explain how and why things changed. We haven't talked about it all yet, but things do change in this situation. Because they change, we are no longer positioned with God in this relationship. So he's no longer our punisher in this scenario for violating a law, because we're going to learn as we move forward that this law becomes obsolete and then becomes something that fades away and disappears forever. So if it's obsolete and it's disappearing and fading away forever, this is not a relationship with God anymore. Let alone the fact that we were not Israelites. Yes, absolutely. It broke his heart, and it kind of made him a little angry, too. Because this is where wrath comes into the picture.
Well, all through Isaiah and Jeremiah, he gives this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But underneath is the, I'm going to restore.
Yeah. There's something coming. There's something coming down the train that's going to change all of this. Exactly right. So so it was never God's heart. You're right on. I'm so happy that you're grabbing that, because this wasn't God's heart. God's heart was for them to be a nation of priests. So let's think for a minute. Now we know, if we jump forward in the timetable, what happens with Israel in their interaction with all of the ites, right? All the different tribes that are in the area. You've got lots of war and all kinds of things that are taking place. But let's do a what if for a minute, okay? What if the Israelites had accepted the Grant Covenant? And what if there had been no law and no partnership, protector, punisher relationship, as the Israelites could have been priests that were embarking on a journey to reconcile mankind to God, even if these other tribes did things similar, it's possible that God's interaction with them would have been different. Because what did this do? This put God into a position where, because of his word, he had to be faithful to protect Israel when they were attacked by other nations. So because of his word, he had to respond in ways that could have been different if it was just a priestly nation and there was still the ability to operate under something that didn't veil him. So when we look at 2 Corinthians 3:4, or actually not 3:4, but we're not going to do the whole thing, but it says 3 through 4 in my notes. Maybe it was 3:4, but it talks about how Paul expresses that this covenant put a veil over God. And this veil that was over God, it veiled God's heart, and it made it difficult for nations to understand who this God was. Because if you're not an Israelite, and you're somebody from another nation, and you're seeing the way that this God punishes his own people and does all kinds of other things in the realm of protection, how would you understand God? How do you understand God the way that we understand God? We're in a different mindset. We're in a different perspective. We have the knowledge of Christ. However, they did not. So Paul explains how this covenant put a veil over God, but then he goes on to say, but in Christ the veil is removed. Thank God. The veil is removed. So we can see God for who he truly is. And somebody who wants to operate with mercy and kindness. His justice is a different type of justice. So this covenant, it did not represent his interests or what he wanted to do. And you think about it, it put a veil or a shroud over God for the next 1,300 years until Jesus came into the scene and did some things. So the law is a veil. The law is a veil that is going to cover his heart. And you can see some examples of how the law ends up not misconstruing, but it causes the Israelites to misunderstand the whole point. So we can take the Sabbath, for example. What is the purpose of the Sabbath? Rest, right? The purpose of the Sabbath is to rest. But over the course of time, multiple and new laws were added to how you were to operate on the Sabbath. So you had all these laws that you had to follow 6 days of the week. And then when you get to your Sabbath day of rest, there were still all these stipulations that you had to make sure you didn't accidentally do. Otherwise, you'd be guilty of violating the law. But Jesus makes a point to say that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the law puts this veil, it shrouds, it covers up, the truth of what's going on. Okay. So that simply is a way for us to understand how the Ten Commandments, when God gave the Ten Commandments, that was a kinship ceremony. And he was inaugurating this new relationship that didn't honor his heart. And who did that initially go to? It was given to Moses as he was up there. So then what happens? We have this scenario. So you all know the story, right? So Moses has gone up to talk to God instead of all of them. And what do the Israelites think happened to Moses?
Or God had taken.
God had taken him. He's dead. They don't know what's going on because he's up there for a while. So they think he's dead. So they make a small calf of gold. I say small because it does say that it was made from a mold. So it's kind of hard for it to be, this monstrous 2-story tall calf if it was cast from a mold. So more than likely, it was this tiny little thing that they made. Okay? Nothing in comparison to God. What did they do? They completely ignored everything that they had gone through, all of the things that God had provided for them, the manna, the quail, the water, all of the things that they had done. And in Exodus 32:6, it says that they had a party as they worshiped this golden calf. Now, some of your scriptures might just say that they had a party. Some of them might just say they worshiped the calf. However, it doesn't really paint the real picture of what happened because there's a lot of scholars who use the Hebrew word that's used to express what they did was a little bit more than just a drunken party. It was probably more of a lewd, drunken, yes, thank you. She said orgy. Gross, despicable, heathenistic. I mean, the debauchery that was going on around this God that they decided was incomprehensible. Well, they didn't even know the strings were there. See, that's the weird thing. They don't even have the law yet. The law was given to Moses. He's got it up there with the 10 Commandments. They don't even have any strings. All they know is that they have been living in this wilderness. And this is even before the 40 years. They just had wandered to Mount Sinai. And this is how they respond to God. So in 32, 9 through 10, we see that God executes severe judgment. Without understanding how much debauchery was taking place around that worship of the golden calf, we kind of miss the point as far as why God responded the way he did. Okay? Clearly violates the 10 Commandments, right? Even though they hadn't received it yet, their delegate was already up there getting it. So they were supposed to honor and wait for the delegate to come down. Just because they hadn't seen the tablets, the ceremony had already taken place. It had already been given. And God responds with extreme judgment. Now, he basically, let's look at this. Exodus 32, 9 through 10. It says, I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation. So in his anger, as he's about to pour out his wrath, he decides for himself, I'm just going to kill them all. And Moses, I'm going to start with you because you're the only one that's faithful. Okay? Did God change his mind? Or did God, in his foreknowledge, know that Moses was going to do what he did and that he really didn't mean what he said?
I noticed that he said, leave me alone. Like, don't try to talk me out of this.
Right?
So he opens the door, right?
Yeah. 32, 11 to 14, Moses does something amazing. And what he does is, as he's beseeching God, he goes into a dialogue of trying to invoke the virtues of the Abrahamic covenant over these people. And says that these are the people that you said were going to fulfill your promise to Abraham. And he does a great job of calming God down. All right? So what ends up happening? Well, God agrees, kind of. Moses smashes the tablets. Okay? And then, after he smashes the tablets, the Lord commands all those who state, I am for the Lord, and a lot of the Levitical family, tribe, comes up and says, I'm with the Lord, and is given the command to slay everyone that was involved in the debauchery. All right? So, the faithful slay the unfaithful. Now, how many died? Anybody know? 3,000 died. So let's take a look at something that's really cool, the way that God loves to, just in his beautiful way, loves to fix things and make things right, right? He likes to make things right. When the kinship covenant was established at Mount Sinai, 3,000 people died. When the law was given, and we read earlier that the law brings death, when the law arrived, the first thing that happened, 3,000 died. Let's fast forward to Acts 2. When the Spirit was poured out, 3,000 were saved. God is in the business of making things right. That kind of gives me chills a little bit to just think about how all of this starts to fit together. You have the two stories, you have the word that says the law brings death, but the Spirit gives life. You have other verses in Romans where it says the law brings wrath. Okay? This is a big deal. It is a really, really big deal. So, what's the result of this scenario? We have a situation where God has given the law, comes down and sees this, slays 3,000 people. In Exodus 33, 1-3, God makes a decision that he once again needs to be kind of like consoled by Moses. Which is still, God is so great, but this kind of just really reinforces how great of a man Moses was. All right? In chapter 33, verses 1-3, God basically is saying, you're going to go ahead and you're going to go to the promised land, but I'm not going with you. I will send an angel to go with you, because if I go with you, this is the Chris Cairns version, I don't know if I am going to be able to hold myself back from wiping you out. I'm going to kill you all. And this grieved the Israelites so much to hear that God was not going to go with them, you know. And so what does Moses do? Well, Moses is required to meet with God, but he has to do it outside of the gathering. So he sets up a tent outside so that he could meet with God, and he ends up having a discussion with God, and again, does the same type of thing where he is going to be able to go with them. So Moses makes, new tablets. He's told by God that he's more than just he's not told with God, but just the ability to meet with God face to face outside of the temple, sitting in the little tent, face to face with God. That's a pretty intimate deal. And that's where you have the story where, Moses asks, to see him or pass by him. And God talks about putting him in the cleft of the rock. And when he goes back up to the mountain, this time Moses chisels out the tablets, but God is still the one who writes with his fingers on the tablets. And those are the tablets that they ended up keeping. And Moses beseeches God to go with them and, claim these people as your inheritance. This is now, we're all the way up to Exodus 34. And then in Exodus 40, how did they know that God was with them? Well, they knew that God was with them when there was the pillar of fire by night and the cloud of smoke during the day. So they always knew that the presence of God was there. But still, this is not quite the covenant that God had in mind. All right, I'm going to erase this. Nope. We only have a few more minutes, and I want to try to, we're going to be able to wrap this up. Because the last thing here is they're about to go into the promised land, right? So as they're about to go into the promised land, before they get there, the book of Leviticus, lots of instructions were given, kind of like a guidebook on how to conduct tabernacle duties and what to eat. If you could sum it all up, all right? That's mainly what Leviticus is. Tabernacle duties, how to interact with God, and how to consecrate yourself, how to, eat things, certain things, all right? So then in Numbers 13, Moses tells them to spy out the land, all right? So send 12 spies, all right? Now, 12 spies, one representative for each of the nations. They're instructed to go and do what? What are they instructed to do?
Check out the giants.
No.
See if they could take it.
No. They were simply sent out there to just look at the land. What is the land like? How big is the food? How prosperous is it? What is this land like that God has given us? They were told to just spy out. Yeah, they were told to be able to go out there and see who's on the land, right? And who are these people that, we need to convince to get out. But the main thrust behind it was just to go there and inspect the land. Come back and give us a report. Show us what this land of milk and honey is like. Well, 10 of the 12 report giants, fear, no faith, didn't even see the milk and honey, right? All they saw were giants and fear. But 2 report like big grapes, grapevines. I think it says something like the 2 of them were carrying grapes that were so big they had to do it over their shoulders because the grapes were so big. Plenty. They come back and they say, this is a great land. Yeah, there's people there, but this is a great land. This is where we're supposed to be. 10 of them say, we don't care what's in that land. There's giants in that land. There's no way we're going to be able to take it. They respond with fear. 2 respond in faith. So God had already given it, but because of their fear, they didn't have any faith in God. They didn't have any faith in their leaders. So these 10, they come up with a plan to kill Moses and take the rest of the people back into slavery. Now, this right here, I don't think that's operating under the rules of the covenant. So if they're planning on doing something that's against the covenant, how does God have to react? How does he respond in faithfulness to his role as punisher? Well, he has to punish them. So what does he end up doing? In Numbers 14, I'll just go Numbers 14. God kills the 10. All right? The 2 are allowed to stay. Mercy, but there still was a sentence that was taking place. He could have just wiped them all out again, but he decides to just slay the 10, and in his mercy continues to punish the rest of those people with a death sentence. And that death sentence was what? That as they wandered for 40 years, they would slowly die off. And that they would not be able to inherit. And when I say they slowly die, it's all of the people that agreed with the plan to wipe out Moses and go back. So all of those that had no faith in God were sentenced to wander the wilderness until they died. And then if you think about it, think of it this way. 40 years go by. Somebody who is 40 years old is going to be dead 40 years from now. Okay? 40 years from now, the young ones, the teens, the 20s, they're going to be in their 50s and 60s. They're ready to finally have a place to rest. And they've seen what God has done throughout that whole time. And then they're led by Joshua and Caleb, because even Moses didn't get into the promised land. Right? Now, we have a little time here for a second. This is where we end, because when Moses dies and Joshua takes up command, there's yet another change. There's another change in covenant that takes place. And that's what we're going to discuss next week. So this Mosaic covenant is broken down into 2 parts. Not just because of how long it is, but because it changes yet again. It was supposed to be grant, wasn't a grant, started as a kinship covenant. But when Joshua comes into the scene, it's going to change yet again. They don't talk about heaven and hell the same. Well, they don't really talk about hell at all too much in the Old Testament. They talk a little bit about it in the New Testament. But, with our perceptions of hell, it's kind of tough for us to figure out, what happened to all of these people. And we can't really give a solid answer to it. But the reality is that even Moses didn't get into the promised land. He died out there in the wilderness with the rest of the tribes that died off within the 40 years. So we would have to ask our question, what happened to all of them? And we don't really have time to have that, question answered here. But, once we get into the new covenant, you'll begin to have some perspectives about, what does it mean for heaven and hell, and what are the different perspectives of hell and things of that nature. So, but that's part 1 of the Mosaic covenant. And we're going to just put an end here.